Welcome to the October 2018 meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, could you please announce our agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you, and good morning, Commissioners. For today's meeting, you will hear 6 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that promotes the use of mid-band spectrum for broadband by proposing to allow new unlicensed uses of the 5.925 to 7.125 gigahertz band while protecting existing and future licensed operations. Second, you will consider a report and order that would make limited changes to the Citizens Broadband Radio service in the 3.5 gigahertz band to increase incentives for innovation and investment, including for mobile 5G services. Third, you will consider a further notice of proposed rulemaking and report an order to simplify and modernize the Commission's cable television rate regulations and update or eliminate outdated rules. Fourth, you will consider a report and order eliminating the requirement that broadcast stations routinely file paper copies of contracts and other documents with the FCC. Fifth, you will consider a report and order that will allow rate of return carriers that receive fixed universal service support to elect incentive regulation for their business data services. A further notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on eliminating ex-ante pricing regulation for lower capacity TDM services offered by rate of return carriers receiving fixed support, and a second further notice of proposed rulemaking proposing to eliminate ex-ante pricing regulation for TDM transport services offered by price cap carriers. Sixth, you will consider an enforcement action. This is your agenda for today. Please note item 3 on the agenda as listed in the October 16th, 2018 Sunshine Notice was adopted by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first item today will be presented by the Office of Engineering and Technology and is entitled Unlicensed Use of the 6 gigahertz band, Expanding Flexible Use in Mid-Band Spectrum between 3.7 and 24 gigahertz. And Julius Knapp, Chief of the Office, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Knapp, we turn the floor to you.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Unlicensed has been a resounding success story. We all use these devices every day and don't even think about it. The applications are too numerous to list, but suffice it to say that unlicensed continues to experience rapid growth and in turn needs access to more spectrum to fuel that growth. The draft notice of proposed rulemaking before you today would do just that. It proposes to make available a substantial amount of additional spectrum for unlicensed devices while protecting existing and future incumbent operations against harmful interference. With me at the table are Nicholas Oros, Barbara Pavon, and Bauman Badapur. The slide that I think we're trying to get up on the screen lists the many people who helped make this item possible, and I'd especially like to thank the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the International Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel for their help. Bauman will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking offers a plan to allow new unlicensed use in the 6 gigahertz band while also ensuring that licensed services operating in this spectrum are protected against harmful interference. We continue to witness explosive demand for more unlicensed devices which provide wireless connectivity for countless products used by American consumers and businesses. The 6 gigahertz band's proximity to some of the most heavily used unlicensed bands make these frequencies especially well suited for the types of unlicensed devices and applications that can advance the Commission's efforts to make broadband connectivity available to all Americans, speed the deployment of 5G services, and support the growing Internet of Things. Our proposal also advances the critical legislative priorities in the Mobile Now Act to identify additional spectrum for unlicensed use. The proposed rules would allow unlicensed devices to operate throughout the breadth of the 6 gigahertz band, but only in locations and frequencies that would not cause harmful interference to the existing and future licensees. Specifically, our proposal consists of rules for two types of unlicensed devices, tailored to protect incumbent services that operate in distinct parts of the 6 gigahertz band. In the 5.925 to 6.425 gigahertz and 6.525 to 6.875 gigahertz subbands, where fixed services and fixed satellite service licensees are authorized, the notice proposes to allow unlicensed devices to use an automated frequency control AFC system to avoid causing harmful interference. The item invites comment as to whether use of the AFC system is necessary for devices that only operate indoors. In the 6.425 to 6.525 gigahertz and 6.875 to 7.125 gigahertz subbands, where broadcast auxiliary, cable television, and fixed satellite services are authorized, unlicensed devices would be permitted only for indoor use with no requirement to use an AFC system. The combination of lower power and indoor operations would protect the licensed services operating on these frequencies from harmful interference. The Office of Engineering and Technology recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buddypour, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many people tout particular technologies and/or economic studies showing the value of new use cases to support allocating additional unlicensed spectrum. But I've never focused intently on such points. While informative, I tend to agree with a previously quoted former employer that the beauty of unlicensed spectrum is that no one can predict what American innovators and creative geniuses will think up next. It's really up to them to turn our efforts into products, services, and endless possibilities for the benefit of our people. Further, it is undisputed that the exponential growth of wireless data, especially over unlicensed networks, has led to severe congestion in our highly prized unlicensed spectrum bands, primarily 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. Consider that total U.S. internet traffic is estimated to increase threefold between 2016 and 2021, and Wi-Fi networks will grow to carry almost 52% of this traffic. For these reasons, I pushed early in my term to make additional bands available for unlicensed community, a view also shared by Congress, including in the enacted Mobile Now Act. Accordingly, I was one of the first voices to advocate for allowing unlicensed use in the 6 gigahertz, and supporters have been able to cajole skeptics to jump on board and help move this notice forward. To be clear, this is prime location for unlicensed services for multiple reasons, but particularly because it's adjacent to the 5 gigahertz and complements the forthcoming clearing efforts in the C-band downlink band. Moreover, studies in the record demonstrate that unlicensed spectrum at 6 gigahertz can likely be done without causing harmful interference to existing incumbents. Now, if we could only open up the 5.9 gigahertz band for unlicensed use as well, for which I believe there are 4 solid votes in favor, we would really be onto something special, as it's the missing link between 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz. Since today's notice takes a giant step to open a large swath of spectrum needed for increased capacity, high speeds, and lower latency for unlicensed 5 gigahertz or technologies not yet envisioned, it has my full support. I look forward to exploring the issues raised in it, including the best means to protect incumbents from harmful interference. I thank the chairman for bringing this to a long-awaited vote, and my colleagues for agreeing to add additional questions at my request, such as questions pertaining to low-power indoor use in the newly minted Uni 5 and Uni 7 bands, including seeking comment on permitting such operations without automatic frequency coordinators and the use of portable devices. I know these ideas and many others in the notice may raise some initial concern, but these are discussions that need to be had, and everyone will have the opportunity to express their views. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Drop it like it's hot spot. Abraham
Thank you, Commissioner.
Linksys. There's more, hang on. John Wilkes Bluetooth. Wu-Tang LAN. Pretty Fly for a Wi-Fi. These, all of which landed, are some of the more creative or at least punny names you might see when searching for a Wi-Fi connection. And the sheer number of network names that pop up confirms what the data tell us. Your neighbors, your family, nearby businesses are all competing for a relatively limited amount of spectrum. And those unlicensed bands are getting congested. After all, these networks are the workhorses of our connected lives. We hear so much in telecom about the last mile. And when we're at home or at work, the final few feet of that last mile are often spanned by Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or another unlicensed technology. Few realize that without this unlicensed spectrum, even the best commercial networks would strain to keep up with consumer demand. In fact, a study out last week shows that even among Americans with unlimited data plans, 2/3 of their data still rides on Wi-Fi. And it's surprising that so much is done with so little. The 2.4 gigahertz band is home to some of the original Wi-Fi devices, cordless phones, baby monitors, and Bluetooth devices that came to market nearly 20 years ago. 2 decades of devices send and receive information over just 83 megahertz of spectrum. The 5 gigahertz band, which is used to transmit at a faster rate and to relieve congestion in 2.4, adds only 150 megahertz. As we move towards 5G, demand on our unlicensed bands will only increase. From the Internet of Things to smart ag to new telehealth applications, we need more spectrum to connect billions of new devices. That's why today's proceeding is so important. It proposes to add 1,200 megahertz of prime mid-band spectrum for unlicensed use. That's 5 times the spectrum available today in the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands. There are issues to be resolved in this proceeding for sure. Would unlicensed use in the 6 gigahertz band cause harmful interference? If so, how can we tailor protections that maximize use of the band? These are technical issues that require the input and engagement of all stakeholders. So I encourage parties to work with the Commission to develop appropriate rules. And we need to do so expeditiously. Few predicted how important the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands would be to the modern world when the FCC made them available more than 30 years ago. That history suggests the enormous potential value of the steps we're taking today. So I want to thank OET for their work on this item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
You may not know it, but your life runs on unlicensed spectrum. It might have been the laptop you popped open this morning to check your email, or it could have been the baby monitor you used to keep tabs on your little one late last night. Maybe it was the fitness tracker you counted on to count your steps, or the music you streamed through your phone to power you through a morning jog. Or it could have been the traffic application you checked before hitting the road for your daily commute, after closing your garage door remotely at the press of a button. No matter who you are or where you live, the odds are good that you have benefited from unlicensed airwaves and Wi-Fi. And these conveniences are not the gifts of the spectrum gods. They are the byproduct of wireless policy choices that were made at the Federal Communications Commission more than 3 decades ago. A renegade band of engineers at this agency led the charge. They challenged the status quo by suggesting that spectrum that was not licensed to individuals could be useful for all. Instead of having the FCC dictate what could be done in certain bands, the agency would leave it up to the public. So the FCC opened a handful of underused frequencies, airwaves that were widely viewed as garbage bands, to anyone who followed some basic technical rules. This was radical. It was edgy stuff. It was a bet that access to some airwaves by public rule rather than by private license would lead to a whole new world of wireless uses. And you know, it was a good bet because in time a standard was developed, 802.11, and this is where Wi-Fi was born. And today, Wi-Fi adds more than $500 billion to the United States economy every year, and $2 trillion globally. It has democratized internet access, helped carriers manage their networks, and fostered all sorts of wild innovation. In fact, it's the perfect sandbox for experimentation because access does not require contract or permission. And as exciting as this is, it means the airwaves used by Wi-Fi are getting crowded. Already, our current Wi-Fi bands are congested because they are used by about 9 billion devices. By the end of the decade, we will see as many as 50 billion devices connecting to our networks through the Internet of Things. You can add that up and do the math. We're going to need a significant swath of new unlicensed spectrum to keep up with demand. And now, of course, is the time to do something about it. Earlier this year, Congress directed the FCC to increase the spectrum resources we devote to Wi-Fi. And that opportunity could come from the 6 gigahertz band, which is the subject of our rulemaking today. It's an ideal place to explore Wi-Fi expansion because it's close to our existing Wi-Fi bands. It also offers an opportunity to introduce wider channels that will take advantage of the new 802.11ax or Wi-Fi 6 standard, and deliver speeds even faster than 1 gigabit per second. In other words, this is how we develop next-generation gigabit Wi-Fi. I appreciate that my colleagues have made changes to this rulemaking at my request. In particular, I am grateful this effort now contemplates more opportunities for low-power indoor Wi-Fi devices throughout the 6 gigahertz band. This will promote economies of scale and facilitate use of the same standards with the nearby 5 gigahertz band. And that last point is important. Because the demands on existing unlicensed airwaves are so great, we need an effort beyond the 6 gigahertz band. We need a fresh look at Wi-Fi opportunities in the 5.9 gigahertz band, and this is overdue. It was back in 1999 that this agency set aside 75 megahertz of spectrum for dedicated short-range communications, which was designed to let cars talk to each other in real time to help reduce accidents. But in the nearly 2 decades since the FCC allocated this spectrum for what's known as DSRC, that has not happened. Testing on it continues, but only a few thousand vehicles have DSRC on board out of the more than 260 million cars on the road. That's not surprising when you consider that autonomous vehicles have already moved on to newer technologies. And that's why the FCC committed to completing tests by January 15th of 2017 to address the safe operation of Wi-Fi devices in this band. But nearly 2 years later, this agency is silent. No results have been released, no decisions have been made. And in the intervening time, the market has mostly moved on beyond the test plan that we developed. Given these facts, it's time for the FCC to take a fresh look at this band and update our efforts. Wi-Fi is a powerful force in the economy. It can foster innovation without license. It can offer a jolt to the Internet of Things, and it can make our lives more connected and more convenient every day. It's time for more of it. And the 6 gigahertz band and 5.9 gigahertz band are the right place to start. So let's get to it.
Thank you, Commissioner. If I asked you for 1989's great accomplishments, you might say the fall of the Berlin Wall, the launch of the Batman film series, and the beginning of the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz unlicensed bands, perhaps in that order. And in the last 3 decades, unlicensed devices have proliferated, as have Batman movies, of course. From Wi-Fi routers to connected home appliances to retro cordless phones for those of us who still have landlines, we use devices that connect via unlicensed spectrum every single day. Indeed, they've become so popular that there's now a shortage of airwaves dedicated for their use. So today, we address this problem by proposing to open up 1,200 megahertz of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band for different types of unlicensed uses. And we seek to do so in a way that will protect incumbent licensed operations in the band. This decision will help us meet the mandate set forth in Ray Baum's Act to make more spectrum available for licensed use. It is also part of our aggressive and balanced spectrum strategy, pushing more licensed and unlicensed spectrum into the commercial marketplace, and including a mix of low-band, mid-band, and high-band spectrum. And with the massive amount of wireless traffic that is offloaded to Wi-Fi, opening up this wide swath of spectrum for unlicensed use could be a big boost to our country's 5G future. We look forward to compiling a robust record and then acting quickly to make more 6 gigahertz spectrum available for unlicensed use. Indeed, I'm optimistic that we should be able to get the job done before the next Batman movie is released. Thanks to the staff that worked on this item across the agency, from the Office of Engineering and Technology, particularly the folks arrayed before us at the table, as well as staff in the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, the International Bureau, the Media Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Office of General Counsel. With that, we'll move to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approved.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the fantastic work on this important item. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 2 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item on your agenda is entitled Promoting Investment in the 3550 to 3700 megahertz band and will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology. Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, will give the introduction.
All right. Mr. Stockdale, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
I'm getting there. Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I'm pleased to present to you the 3.5 gigahertz band report and order. I am joined at the table today by Jessica Griffinius, Matthew Pearl, and Paul Powell of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and Julia Snap of the Office of Engineering and Technology. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Jessica will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
The report and order presented for your consideration today would adopt limited changes to the rules governing the Citizens Broadband Radio Service in the 3.5 gigahertz band. The item would make targeted changes in order to spur additional investment and broader deployment in the band, promote robust and efficient spectrum use, and help ensure the rapid deployment of advanced wireless technologies, including 5G, in the United States. The changes in the report and order are warranted in light of transformations that have occurred, both domestically and globally, in the past several years, including increased demand for mid-band spectrum and increased interest globally in using the 3.5 gigahertz band for 5G. The revised rules are designed to increase flexibility so that licensees can efficiently deploy next-generation networks in addition to other technologies. Specifically, the report and order would revise the rules for priority access licenses, or PALs, that will be issued in the band. These changes include modification of the geographic license area from census tracts to counties, with the possibility of package bidding in large metro areas, an increase in the license term to 10 years, with the ability to renew the license in successive terms, adoption of end-of-term performance requirements, elimination of restrictions on the number of PALs made available in a given market based on the number of applications filed, adoption of bidding credits for designated small and rural entities, and the ability to partition and disaggregate PALs on the secondary market. The report and order would also modify public disclosure requirements to safeguard sensitive device registration data and revise technical rules to support operations over wider bandwidth channels without altering existing interference protections for services operating outside of the band. We anticipate that these changes will serve the public interest by providing the certainty and stability needed to facilitate more robust investment and broader deployment in the 3.5 gigahertz band by a wide array of users. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology recommend adoption of this item and request editorial privileges to make technical conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Griffinius, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Oh, what a good day it is. I've got a lot of things on my mind, so sit back and hopefully I'll be able to express them all. The U.S. has a wireless marketplace that other countries envy and try to emulate, in part because of our commitment to free market principles and practices. In sum, the Commission makes spectrum available under flexible use policies, assigns through multi-round auctions, and encourages an active secondary market, ultimately facilitating a competitive marketplace and placing the nation's spectrum into the hands of those who maximize its use for Americans. These are the very same policies that are the foundation of today's order. By modifying the licensed portion of the 3.5 gigahertz or CBRS band, we ensure that there will be maximum investment, continued development, and successful deployment of this spectrum. We also open this mid-band spectrum for 5G technologies, which have developed since the original proceeding and have been targeted for global harmonization, wide area networks, and 5G roaming. This change in circumstances is a key reason we must act as outlined in this item. Specifically, it was clear during a review that the past administration's rules were not supportive of large-scale deployments such as mobile or 5G networks. Imagine being at the dawn of the Uber age, having the government declare only Toyota Priuses can be Ubers. As many opponents to this order have admitted, the rules in place favored small-scale fixed networks by making it unattractive for any other type of deployment. Basically, the rules were designed so that a select group could get licenses on the cheap. Some of these entities assert to this day that these are their licenses. They seem to be forgetting that spectrum belongs to the people, and it is the Commission's obligation to manage it for the public interest of all Americans. We right the ship today by fixing the CBRS band so that there are opportunities for all, regardless of whether an entity is interested in fixed or mobile, 5G, or another technology. Among other changes, we modify the rules to ensure priority access licenses, or PALs, will be available in all markets and change the terms to 10 years with an expectation for renewal. These will allow winning bidders to freely invest in networks, knowing that they will follow our rules and meet performance requirements. Their investments will not be stranded. The contentious debate, however, centered on the appropriate geographic license size, ranging from 74,000 census tracts set by the previous commission, to 416 partial economic areas with other options in between. After almost a year of conversation and considerable movement by some parties, which I greatly appreciate, it was clear that a consensus agreement could not be reached among all parties. So the Commission had to make the appropriate and justified policy decisions. We are doing that today by changing the geographic license size to counties, which amount to approximately 3,200 market areas nationwide. Contrary to what some are asserting, we did not just throw our hands up in the air, throw a dart at the dartboard, succumb to political solutions, or draw straws because we couldn't figure out what to do. Nor is this an effort to give licenses to the nationwide providers, or turn this into a 5G only band. As I like to say, such claims are pure gibberish. Counties are appropriate because they are big enough that larger mobile providers will be able to successfully aggregate PALs, especially with the option of package bidding, but small enough that they are attractive to small and rural wireless companies, cable operators, and new entrants. I thank the nationwide providers, small and rural mobile operators, the cable industry, the wireline carriers for supporting these efforts and being constructive partners in the endeavor. This geographic license size will also alleviate the harmful interference issues that arise from all of the border created by 74,000 census tracts, especially in metropolitan areas where the use of a PAL in one census tract could preclude the use of the same spectrum in adjacent areas, require fewer coordination agreements between neighbors, and allow greater and more cost-efficient deployments. Rural providers have also said that census tracts are too small and will not let them take advantage of the CBRS band's propagation characteristics to bring broadband internet to all those seeking it. Further, distributing licenses at the county level will expedite the auction and bring spectrum that by some accounts was needed yesterday into the marketplace as soon as possible. It became apparent after meeting with our auction team that we could not conduct a timely auction for over 74,000 markets or more than 500,000 licenses. I was told that instead the plan was a single sealed bid auction. I cannot support abandoning our successful multi-round auction approach that provides flexibility, price discovery, and ensures licenses go to their highest value under any circumstances rather than in the hands of a select few. I'm bewildered that some suggest that returning to a framework that imposes command and control style spectrum policy using an old-fashioned sealed bid auction is somehow an innovative, new idea that will ensure our continual leadership in wireless. In fact, it seems like a colossal step backwards. That said, I recognize and fully appreciate the efforts of interested parties in getting this complex experiment up and running. I'm disappointed, however, by some parties' arguments that their investments will be stranded due to the inability to access the spectrum. Those claims are simply false. First, no one is ever guaranteed to win licenses at auction, so it rings hollow that these investments were solely contingent on the ability to win PALs. Regardless, I hope the skeptics of these new rules will still participate in the auction because the outcomes are unpredictable, and despite their protests, they do not know if they will be outbid. No one would have guessed that the largest two mobile providers would basically take a pass on the 600 megahertz auction. Additionally, we are providing bidding credits to those qualified to help offset the costs. Second, these investments were made in large part to access the 80 megahertz of GAA or unlicensed like spectrum that will remain available. Nothing we do today changes the availability of this spectrum. Ironically, I put the idea on the table of converting some GAA spectrum to licenses, even trying to find a way to offer them by census tract in a much larger auction, but that was a non-starter, as these entities understandably wanted GAA. Further, with our use or share policies, if PAL spectrum is not being used, it can be accessed by GAA users. Lastly, today's item also expands secondary market options. Some argue that the secondary market may not be as effective as we would hope. I would welcome a full discussion on how the Commission can incentivize secondary markets. If we can provide further incentives to invigorate the marketplace, we should look into doing so. Similarly, proponents have stated that the performance requirements in this item are insufficient. These metrics were reasonably formulated, taking into account that this spectrum will be offered at the county level, which is the smallest area the Commission has offered at a lower power than normal licenses, and that providers will have to protect federal users. I'm a strong proponent of stringent build-out requirements, and in fact have asked parties in various proceedings about ways we can update our metrics for today's technologies. I am always met with silence. I would be supportive of efforts to modernize and strengthen our construction benchmarks for auctions going forward. Both issues, however, should be looked at holistically and are broader than the current 3.5 gigahertz proceeding. In conclusion, I want to thank the chairman for providing me the opportunity to lead this effort. I would also like this opportunity to acknowledge the staff for their efforts throughout this proceeding, who worked long and hard to get us to this point. Your work does not go unnoticed, and I thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Thompson, North Dakota is a town of 1,010 people. It sits about 90 miles from the Canadian border. It has more churches than stoplights. The tallest structure that you'll find along the town's dirt roads is a grain elevator owned by a farmer's co-op. The closest Apple store is a 4.5-hour drive away. It's the type of place that big companies could easily overlook when they plan 5G and next-gen broadband deployments. But right now, a fixed wireless provider is using 3.5 gigahertz spectrum in an experimental FCC license to beam 100 megabit broadband to the community. To do this, the provider attached an antenna to the top of that dusty grain elevator, and from that height, they can reach houses nearly 8 miles away. Justin, one of the company's network techs, took me up there on a snowy day about 2 weeks ago. He even pointed out a home about 4 miles away that topped out at 238 megabits per second, and he was quick to note that the speeds would be even higher once the customer upgraded their in-home equipment. He talked optimistically about the 3.5 gigahertz band and the company's fixed wireless offering helping to close the digital divide. The key, as his company put it, is to strike a balance between the desire to adopt smaller license areas and the practical considerations that affect designing and deploying real-world wireless networks. Auctioning licenses at the county level, not census tract, they say, represents the best compromise and will support next-gen deployments in Thompson and many rural communities just like it. Other providers serving rural America agree. And elected leaders from rural states, including Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska, all argue that county-sized licenses will serve the needs of their rural communities. Not everyone agrees. Some larger providers want bigger license areas. Some smaller ones want census tracts. In the end, we adopt an approach that's not tailored to any particular technology or business model. Rather, our approach is targeted at ensuring robust investment and deployment from big cities to rural communities. It's suited to a wide variety of business models, from broadband to next-gen IoT and industrial applications. Commissioner O'Reilly deserves credit for his leadership on these issues and in this band. He worked hard to bridge the gaps between stakeholders and to ensure that this critical piece of mid-band spectrum will work in the real world, and not just in theory. And while there's no doubt we'll soon hear overheated rhetoric about the decision to license spectrum over counties versus census tracts, remember this: we're doing something we've never done before. We've never auctioned licenses over geographic areas as small as counties. We've never used a SAS to coordinate spectrum access, and we've never implemented a use or share regime, one that both guards against spectrum warehousing and allows a WISP, a manufacturer, or any other entity to access the entire 3.5 gigahertz band, even channels that have been licensed to another provider. I'm confident that our innovative and experimental approach to 3.5 gigahertz will succeed. So I want to commend Commissioner O'Reilly again on his leadership and thank the teams in the Wireless Bureau and the Office of Engineering and Technology for their work on the item. It has my support. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Throughout the course of the Federal Communications Commission's history, there have been opportunities, big and small, to sway the course of spectrum policy. For the most part, this agency has a proud tradition of rising to the challenge. Decades ago, we took the academic ideas of Ronald Coase and ushered in a new era of spectrum auctions. We pioneered the use of unlicensed spectrum and the airwaves we now know and use every day as Wi-Fi. More recently, we blazed a trail for two-sided incentive auctions with last year's first of its kind repurposing of broadcast spectrum. With each of these efforts, we reoriented ourselves from what was to what could be. In doing so, we changed the way that wireless systems are developed and distributed, not just domestically, but worldwide. But no one will count today's decision as a shining example of our daring, because here we fall short. Our innovative spirit is in retreat. That's because today this agency reverses course on the experimental vision we had for wireless policy in the 3.5 gigahertz band. This is short-sighted. Instead of offering a bold new vision, we adopt more of the stale policies of the spectrum past. Let's begin with what could have been. 3 years ago, this agency recognized that our traditional spectrum auctions needed an update and that the 3.5 gigahertz band was the perfect place to test a new framework. Instead of relying on the traditional binary choice between licensed and unlicensed, the agency adopted an unprecedented three-tiered model for spectrum sharing and management. On top of that, we experimented with a new mix of service rules aimed at lowering barriers to entry, cultivating new sources of investment and competition, and creating new opportunities to reach rural and hard-to-serve areas of the country. We accomplished this by adopting license areas based on census tracts, shortening license terms to 3 years, and setting up frameworks to support lightweight leasing. Together, these rules made our scarce spectrum resources more abundant for all. They put this spectrum in reach of non-traditional wireless interests who want to innovate and join the ranks of those who bid on airwaves and support the Internet of Things. This had all the hallmarks of a wild success. We saw interest in the 3.5 gigahertz band auction from far and wide. In addition to the familiar carriers, we had interest from entities that support industrial operations and wanted to use this spectrum for intelligent manufacturing, power generation and distribution, and healthcare. Our record supported its use for advanced inspection and sensor technologies, including aerial drones, terrestrial crawlers, and new robotics. The American Petroleum Institute expressed interest in its use for updating drilling operations. The Port of Los Angeles wanted to explore its use for sharing shipping data. And rural interests saw a unique opportunity to bring more service and more competition to remote areas of the country that are too often left behind. This was exciting. With a creative framework for the 3.5 gigahertz band, along with smaller licenses and shorter terms, the universe of bidders in our auctions was poised to grow. This, of course, is precisely what we need for successful auctions in the future. Moreover, the enthusiasm for this effort was real. Millions were invested in exploring its possibilities. More than 200 experimental authorizations were granted. Multiple applications were received from aspiring database providers. Protocols regarding operations, interoperability, security, and device testing were all underway. But instead of seizing this opportunity, we are in retreat. What this agency adopts today is a hollow version of our initial proposal. Instead of doing something new, we are reverting to the old. We take what was most innovative about our 3.5 gigahertz band model and cast it aside in favor of existing business models. We expand licenses from census tracts to counties and all but bless even larger service territories at auction. We extend the terms for licenses. We adopt last-generation build-out requirements for an innovation band that was designed for flexible new services and sensors. This is a lost opportunity. In our effort to reach this messy compromise, we've created a band that is not well suited to the services of today and offers too few opportunities for the services of tomorrow. This is like being at the dawn of the Uber age and doubling down on taxi medallions. It's at odds with the experimentation that spectrum policy needs for a successful future, and it lacks the audacity that has been a powerful part of our wireless success in the past. I dissent.
Thank you, Commissioner. Last year, the FCC decided to take another look at the 3.5 gigahertz band in order to better promote its potential for 5G and the American leadership in that next generation of wireless connectivity. And I asked Commissioner O'Reilly, who graciously agreed to take on that leadership role. In particular, the agency and Commissioner O'Reilly wanted to re-examine the rules governing the Priority Access License, or PAL tier. The modifications proposed included a change to the size of the licenses to be auctioned off. Now, striking a balance here wasn't easy. Some wanted the FCC to maintain its previous decision to license the PAL tier by census tracts. Others wanted the Commission to change the license size to a significantly larger geographic area called partial economic areas. Others called for county-based licenses, and still others proposed a hybrid of these zones. After extensive deliberations and under Commissioner O'Reilly's leadership, the FCC today charts a middle course. On one hand, it finds that census tracts are too small. For example, there are over 2,000 census tracts in New York City alone, which would make it incredibly difficult to acquire the necessary licenses to deploy 5G at scale. On the other hand, the FCC finds that partial economic areas are too large. They would significantly limit the range of potential licensees interested in making this band work. And so, we find that county-based licenses are just right. This compromise will allow interested parties, large and small, to bid on 3.5 gigahertz spectrum in order to provide 5G services. Now, to be sure, some have claimed that our decision today is bad for rural America, but that's just not true. For example, the county-based approach has been endorsed by the Rural Wireless Association, which told us that, and I quote, "The use of county-based license sizes will allow rural providers to participate in the 3.5 gigahertz auction for priority access licenses and further deploy rural broadband service." This compromise has also been endorsed by NTCA, the Rural Broadband Association. It has also been argued that our decision today will benefit large carriers at the expense of small carriers. But here, too, the arrow misses its mark. The Competitive Carrier Association, for example, which represents smaller carriers, strongly backs our decision today, saying that, and I quote, "County license sizes provide competitive carriers, especially those that serve rural areas, with a meaningful opportunity to bid on and acquire spectrum to provide these areas with the latest broadband services." License sizes aside, we make other necessary changes today to promote investment and innovation in the 3.5 gigahertz band, including extending the license terms and giving an expectancy of license renewal. And of course, our three-tiered framework ensures that efficient use of the band will happen regardless of license sizes. And this is because even after PALs are granted, general authorized access users can provide service in the PAL spectrum until licensees deploy. Now, taken together, all of these reforms will make this band a sandbox for 5G. And it represents another aspect of our comprehensive 5G fast plan to secure American leadership in this next generation of wireless connectivity. I also want to thank Commissioner O'Reilly and his staff for their extensive efforts over the past year. They pored over the record, they met with many interested parties, and all of them, I would argue, and they also found a balanced path forward that enjoys broad support. Thanks also, as Commissioner O'Reilly did, to the staff who worked on this item and who continue to make the 3.5 gigahertz band a success. Kamran Edemad, Jessica Griffinius, Joyce Jones, Gary Michaels, Matthew Pearl, Paul Powell, Kelly Quinn, Jeremy Reynolds, Becky Schwartz, Christian Segura, Dana Schaefer, Don Stockdale, Cecilia Sulhoff, and Peter Trachtenberg from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Corey Cahill, Naveed Golshai, Julie Knapp, Robert Pavlik, and Axel Rodriguez from the Office of Engineering and Technology, Shannon Wilkerson from the Office of Communications and Business Opportunities, and David Horowitz, Bill Richardson, and Anjali Singh from the Office of General Counsel. We really appreciate the hard work. With that, we will move to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approved.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Dissent.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks, folks, for the work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 3 on the agenda today?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the Media Bureau and is entitled Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, Revisions to Cable Television Rate Regulations, Implementation of Sections of the Cable Television Consumer Protection and Competition Act of 1992, Rate Regulation, Adoption of Uniform Accounting System for the Provision of Regulated Cable Service, and Cable Pricing Flexibility. Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
Today, the Media Bureau presents a further notice of proposed rulemaking and report and order that seek to simplify and modernize the Commission's cable rate regulation framework. As part of our media modernization initiative, this item seeks input on ways to replace the current rules and alternatively on ways to revise the current rules to lessen their burden on both cable operators and local franchising authorities. This is the 13th rulemaking that we have begun since this initiative was announced just over a year ago. Joining me at the table are Martha Heller, Brendan Murray, and Katie Costello of the Media Bureau's Policy Division, and Katie Costello will present the item.
Great.
It's automatic.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, We are pleased to present this further notice of proposed rulemaking and report in order. Section 623 of the Communications Act requires the Commission to adopt regulations to ensure that rates charged for the basic tier of cable service are reasonable. In the 1990s, when there was little competition in the video services marketplace, the Commission developed a complex regulatory scheme to implement this statutory requirement. Today, cable operators face far more competition, and very few local franchising authorities remain engaged in rate regulation. Specifically, there are communities in only 2 states, Hawaii and Massachusetts, that still regulate rates. In addition, Congress eliminated rate regulation for cable services other than the basic service tier nearly 20 years ago. Because of these changes, the further notice of proposed rulemaking first asks whether the current regulatory scheme can be replaced in its entirety with a simpler approach, and seeks comment on 2 possible ways to do this. In addition, the further notice seeks comment on whether to deregulate equipment used to receive unregulated tiers of service, exempt some small cable systems from regulation, and clarify that cable services provided to commercial establishments are not subject to rate regulation. The further notice also seeks comment on modernizing rules that rely on dated financial information in determining rates, eliminating rules and forms that are no longer necessary, and updating or clarifying some existing rules to accommodate the revised methodology or to reflect the deregulation of services. Finally, the report in order eliminates or revises some obsolete and outdated rules and terminates a moot docket. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the further notice of proposed rulemaking and report in order, and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Costello, for your work. We will now turn to Commissioner O'Reilly for any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Overall, I want to start and thank you for your great leadership on this modernization effort. Really appreciate 13 items in 12 months or so. Really impressive. Here, I really appreciate the chairman's efforts in this notice to update the framework for calculating basic cable rates to the extent any local franchise authority, or LFA, has the desire and requisite facts to pursue a case. In particular, I applaud the proposal to exempt small cable systems from rate regulation. Thankfully, the universe of situations in which this proposed structure would apply is fairly narrow, as few LFAs currently regulate basic cable rates, and few are unlikely to do so going forward. Because of the development of competition in the offering of video services, which is far better arbiter and protector of consumers than bureaucratic calculations, the need and value for such regulations is limited. Moreover, the Commission's work on the presumptive burden and closing old rate petitions, which I understand have completed, has made most of this discussion moot, but still important. On that note, I appreciate my colleagues' willingness to clarify the draft to ensure our presumptive burden on local franchise authorities was not affected by this item. Having made the right decision and survived a court challenge, I have no intention of allowing that rule to be reversed. From a larger perspective, we need to acknowledge and substantially deregulate cable operators, and then put that in quotes, to reflect the current state of the video marketplace, which includes well-funded and highly successful over-the-top providers that are rightfully not governed by archaic rules designed to implement woefully outdated statutory provisions. Here are just a few reforms the Commission should consider. 1, limit the shenanigans of LFAs during franchise transfers and renewals. 2, prevent mandated new broadband networks builds for the use by LFAs. 3, state that gap accounting is appropriate when determining franchise fees. 4, allow cable operators to modify their franchises so that they can better respond to market conditions. And 5, allow cable operators to offer skinny bundles to respond to market demands. This list is far from exclusive, but would go a long way towards removing added burdens placed on cable operators at the expense of consumers. Again, I thank the chairman for his incredible work on this entire effort, and I thank him here.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly, for the kind words. Commissioner Carr.
No statement, thank you.
Oh, okay. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I'll move along, no statement either.
You're not so lucky. Okay. Because of changes in the video marketplace, cable rates are only regulated in some communities in 2 states, Hawaii and Massachusetts. And even in those communities, only rates for one tier of service, the basic service tier, are regulated. Yet the FCC's cable rate regulations are mind-numbingly complex, filling up 52 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. And we actually looked this up yesterday. They're also outdated, and you don't need to do field research to know that, although we're happy to do so. For example, some rules refer to forms that are no longer in active use. And so the time has come for a wholesale review of our complicated web of cable rate regulations and forms. Our aim here is pretty simple: to dramatically clarify and simplify these regulations and to bring them up to date. And this effort reflects one of the baseline principles of this commission. Today's regulations should match today's marketplace. My thanks to the staff who did excellent work on this important item, as they've done through the entire MMRI process: Michelle Carey, Katie Costello, Martha Heller, Tom Horan, Nancy Murphy, Brendan Murray, Holly Sauer and Sarah Weitzel from the Media Bureau, and Susan Aaron and David Consul from the Office of General Counsel. We'll proceed to vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approved.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted and with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks again for all the work. Madam Secretary, moving right along to item number 4.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 4, entitled Amendment of Section 73.3613 of the Commission's Rules regarding filing of contracts, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, will also be presented by the Media Bureau, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, once again will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Carey, feel free.
Thank you. The next item the Media Bureau presents is a report and order that eliminates a nearly 80-year-old requirement that broadcasters routinely file paper copies of certain contracts and other documents with the Commission. Joining me at the table are Brendan Holland, Chris Clark, and Varsha Mangal of the Media Bureau, and Chris will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, I am pleased to present this report and order eliminating the paper filing requirement in Section 73.3613 of the Commission's rules. Currently, this rule requires licensees and permittees of commercial and non-commercial AM, FM, television, and international broadcast stations to file paper copies of certain documents with the Commission, including network affiliation agreements, articles of incorporation, bylaws, stock agreements, certain personnel agreements, and certain time brokerage and joint sales agreements. Broadcast licensees and permittees have been required to file these documents with the Commission since the late 1930s. And at that time, paper filings were the only available method of submission. Today, however, these documents are available to the Commission and the public through our online public inspection file rules, making routine paper filings redundant and unnecessarily burdensome. The order concludes that eliminating these paper filings and relying on the Commission's existing online public file rules will reduce burdens on broadcasters while preserving transparency. Specifically, the Commission and the public can still obtain relevant information online in a timely fashion. Our online public file rules require that broadcasters either upload the relevant documents to the online public file or list the documents in the public file and provide a copy to requesting parties within 7 days. For international broadcast stations, which are currently subject to the paper filing requirements but do not maintain online public inspection files, the order eliminates these paper filings but retains the Commission's ability to obtain documents upon request as needed. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the report and order and requests editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark, for your presentation. We'll turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
No statement. Thank you.
Commissioner Carr.
You know, a lot of people think that on these media
I knew it.
modernization items,
Oh, man.
I just get up here and make up stories about Saturday morning. Well, once upon a time, not so long ago, Tommy used to work on the docks. Unions been on strike. He's down on his luck. It's tough. It's tough. Gina works the diner all day. Working for her man, she brings home her pay for love. She says that we've got to hold on to what we've got. And unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, thanks to your punitive deregulatory agenda, one thing they can't hold on to anymore is the paper copies of station docs. But nonetheless, I will approve of the item.
Living on a prayer indeed. Well, that's where we all. Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I'm just going to approve.
I'll keep it simple. 1939, the FCC requires broadcasters to file paper copies of certain contracts with the commission. 2018, there's a thing called the internet. Still, broadcasters now have the option of either posting these documents online in their public inspection file or maintaining an up-to-date list in their online file and providing copies to anyone who asks within 7 days. So anyone who cares to access these documents, which is virtually nobody, can easily do so. This regulation is no longer necessary. In fact, it's counterproductive, so we're repealing it. I'd like to thank the staff that worked on this order. From the Media Bureau, Ty Bream, Michelle Carey, Chris Clark, Martha Heller, Brendan Holland, Tom Harand, Varsha Mangal, Holly Sauer, and Sarah Weitzel. And from the Office of General Counsel, Dave Consul. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted. The editorial privilege is granted as requested. Thanks to the team. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 5 on the agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 5, entitled Regulation of Business Data Services for Rate of Return Local Exchange Carriers, Business Data Services in an Internet Protocol Environment, Special Access for Price Cap Local Exchange Carriers, will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau. And Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. It would not be an open meeting if the hardscrabble team from Wireline was not sitting at the table in front of us. So, Ms. Monteith, thank you and your team for showing up today. The floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Today, the Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration a report and order, second further notice of proposed rulemaking, and further notice of proposed rulemaking that promotes investment and competition for business data services in areas served by rate of return carriers. In furtherance of these goals, the report and order, if adopted, will provide rate of return carriers that receive fixed, high-cost universal service support the opportunity to voluntarily transition their business data services from rate of return regulation to a lighter touch incentive regulatory framework. Additionally, the second further notice and further notice will seek comment on the appropriate regulatory framework for price cap carriers' TDM-based transport services and rate of return carriers' lower capacity TDM-based transport services, respectively. I would like to thank the Pricing Policy Division staff for their hard work on this item, as well as our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel for their invaluable input. Seated with me at the table from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Lisa Hone, Deputy Bureau Chief, and from the Bureau's Pricing Policy Division, Pam Arlock, Division Chief, David Sessiger, Deputy Division Chief, and Chris Coves, Attorney Advisor. Chris will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The report and order before you furthers the Commission's long-standing goal of encouraging carriers to migrate from inefficient, burdensome, cost-based regulation to incentive regulation that promotes efficiency, reduces regulatory burdens, and encourages competition. The order allows rate of return carriers receiving model-based or other fixed, high-cost universal service support to voluntarily transition their business data services from rate of return to lighter touch incentive regulation. Carriers eligible to make this election include those receiving universal service support under the Alternative Connect America Cost Model, or ACAM, and the Alaska Plan, price cap affiliates, and carriers that accept future offers of ACAM support or otherwise transition away from legacy cost-based support. These carriers no longer require cost justification for universal service support, and those that elect the new regulatory framework will be relieved of the obligation to prepare burdensome cost studies to justify rates for their business data services. Electing carriers will transition their lower speed TDM-based business data services at or below the capacity of a DS3 from rate of return regulation to a lighter touch incentive regulatory framework. As part of that framework, electing carriers will have greater pricing flexibility to respond to market forces by offering contract tariffs and volume and term discounts for these services. This approach will reduce regulatory burdens and encourage electing carriers to be more efficient, resulting in cost savings that can be passed on to customers or be used for network investment. The order adopts a competitive market test that the Commission will use to determine whether an electing carrier's lower speed, TDM-based end-user channel termination services are competitive and therefore should be detariffed. The order directs the Wireline Competition Bureau to release a public notice identifying the results of the competitive market test and to rerun the test every 3 years. The order also removes from ex-ante pricing regulation electing carriers packet-based and higher capacity TDM-based business data services because the costs and potential risks of regulation outweigh the benefits and given the lack of evidence of market power in these product markets. As part of effectuating these changes, the order forbears from applying several provisions of the Communications Act to electing carriers' business data services, including Section 203 tariffing requirements, cost assignment and jurisdictional separations rules, and related reporting requirements. To provide electing carriers and their customers time to adjust to detariffing, the order adopts a 36-month transition period and temporarily freezes electing carriers' rates for a 6-month period. At the same time, the order affirms the Commission's core statutory obligations pursuant to Sections 201, 202, and 208 of the Communications Act to ensure that the rates, charges, and practices of these carriers remains just and reasonable and not unreasonably discriminatory. In light of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals' recent decision, largely upholding the Commission's 2017 Business Data Services rules, but finding insufficient notice to relieve price cap carriers' TDM-based transport services from ex-ante pricing regulation, the second further notice now proposes to detariff and relieve from ex-ante pricing regulation price cap carriers' TDM-based transport services and seeks comment on this proposal. The further notice also seeks comment on the appropriate regulatory framework to apply to electing rate of return carriers' lower capacity TDM-based transport services. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges with respect to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coves. We'll now turn to comments on the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit a longer statement but make a couple points. In 2017, this commission generally deregulated business data services for price cap carriers, relying on competitive markets to achieve better outcomes for enterprise consumers than our previously regulatory scheme would have allowed. Today, we further this effort by offering model-based rate of return carriers the option to convert their BDS offerings to incentive regulation and altogether eliminate ex-ante pricing regulations for electing carriers' high-speed services. While converting from rate of return regulation may not be the solution for every business, I anticipate that many carriers will be eager to take advantage of the opportunity to forgo burdensome yearly cost studies and operate with greater investment flexibility. The item has my strong support, although if there is one hang-up, I might have directed electing carriers to set their initial rates at a lower rate of return. Since the transition to incentive regulation is voluntary, the fully transitioned 9.75 rate of return designated in our last order seems appropriate. I am, however, grateful for the recirculated draft's clarification that carriers electing during a second window would be required to set their rates according to the applicable rate of return in the year of their election. Likewise, I'm pleased by the decision to forbear from applying separations and other cost assignment rules to electing carriers. Thanks to regulatory and marketplace evolution, the process for separating regulated costs between interstate and intrastate jurisdictions has become increasingly irrelevant and unnecessary. With an additional subset of carriers no longer subject to the legacy rules, the case for comprehensive separations reform is weaker than ever. It is inappropriate to reopen this can of worms, and I'm thankful that we don't do it here. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. A few weeks ago, I had the chance to visit Morris, Minnesota, which is a small town just east of the South Dakota border. In fact, if you didn't get off Highway 9, you'd pass right by Morris before the next song came on the radio. It's there that I visited with two of the largest job creators in the community. One is a dairy farm that Brad and Krista help run. It started as a family farm 80 years ago. And today, Its employees own a large share of the operation in its 1,000-strong herd of cattle. Broadband is now key to the operation. All the cows have e-tags on their ears, which monitor vital signs and movements. And the employees at the dairy now use smartphone apps and a Wi-Fi connection to fine-tune everything from feeding regimes to the cow carousel that lets workers milk dozens of cows while they go by on their 7-minute circle around the room. Later, I toured a manufacturing plant in Morris that employs about 800 people. The company's skilled workforce produces steel conveyors and storage tanks for the energy industry. As our CEO, Micah, walked me around the plant floor, he said that business and its hundreds of good-paying jobs simply would not be in Morris without a high-speed broadband connection. So when we talk about getting more broadband to more Americans, we need to keep in mind the broader economic benefits and jobs that broadband brings to small towns like Morris. A universal service program is a key part of the solution in communities like this. By continuing to provide sufficient and predictable support, we'll help encourage deployment where it's needed most. And by modernizing the rules for carriers that receive USF support, we can provide the right incentives for carriers to bring broadband to homes and businesses in the hardest to serve parts of the country. Today's decision is a good example of that. For BDS, or the type of broadband services often purchased by businesses, the order allows smaller rural providers to transition to less burdensome incentive-based regulation. Doing so would eliminate the need for expensive cost studies, tariff filings, as well as compliance with cost assignment and separation rules. The resulting savings can then be passed along to consumers or invested in new networks. And this could make a real difference for businesses in Morris and across rural America. So I want to thank the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for their work on the item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Business data services are an essential part of the digital economy. These high-capacity, dedicated services sustain our wireless networks, facilitate commercial transactions, and support communications that American businesses rely on every day. Here, in a grab bag of decision-making and rulemaking, the Federal Communications Commission updates its business data services policies to respond to a court remand and address issues for a subset of carriers that have opted into new model-based universal service support. While I support the outcome of today's decision, I concur because its analytical shortcomings are real. Instead of conducting analysis about the state of the market, this order just draws parallels where we can. In doing so, it borrows analysis from an earlier decision involving much larger carriers with far greater economies of scale and determines for smaller providers the same circumstances could exist in rural areas. But there is no data to demonstrate the truth of this assertion. In other words, we take it on faith that price cap and rate of return areas have competitive characteristics that merit identical regulatory treatment despite years of history that suggest the contrary. I like faith. I like hope. But I don't think they suffice as regulatory policy. I think data should be at the center of everything we do, so when we reform our policies to reflect changing times and technologies, our work is supported by evidence on the ground. Here we miss that mark, so I respectfully concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. In attracting infrastructure investment, as in catching flies, honey works better than vinegar. And for too long, the FCC's approach to regulating the market for dedicated enterprise services, what we call business data services, or BDS, was vinegar-based. It was marked by price controls and other micromanagement. This started to change in the 1990s as the FCC began to shift carriers' regulated services away from burdensome, inefficient cost-based regulation to incentive regulation under the leadership of the august Chairman Kennard. The history since then confirms the common sense intuition that lighter touch incentive regulation promotes deployment and competition. Well, today, we continue to sweeten the regulatory landscape for infrastructure investment. In particular, we allow certain carriers to opt out of yesteryear's rate of return regulations of business data services. For these carriers, such services may be their only offerings subject to such requirements, which means that they are forced through a regulatory gauntlet for just this part of their overall business. Ironically, a business that is facing increasing competition throughout the country. I'll note as well that this incentive regulation option for certain rate of return carriers matches relief that we granted to price cap carriers last year. And as we did back then, we apply a competitive market test and a transition period to help ensure appropriate regulation and a smooth adjustment, respectively. My thanks to the tremendously talented staff who worked on this item, Pam Arlick, Irina Saskov, Justin Fall, Lisa Hone, William Kehoe, Christopher Coves, Richard Kwiatkowski, Chris Monteith, Belinda Nixon, Eric Ralph, Marvin Sachs, Douglas Slaughton, Shane Taylor, and David Zessiger from the Wireline Competition Bureau, and Marlene Barzilai, Billy Layton, Richard Mallon, and Linda Oliver from the Office of General Counsel. We will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Concur.
Chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the WCV team. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the final item on your agenda today is an Enforcement Bureau action. Rosemary Harold, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And while EB is getting situated, because this is an enforcement-related matter, we're going to switch up the order slightly, as we typically have done for commission-level items like this in the past that present a notice of apparent liability for forfeiture or a forfeiture order at an open meeting. As with all open meetings, the Bureau circulated this item to every commissioner at least 3 weeks ago. But there is a longstanding practice at the agency that we don't publicly disclose the target of an investigation unless and until the commission decides to take enforcement action. For this item, this means that the agency formally votes on the item and then hears a brief presentation on the item from the Bureau before proceeding to any statements that commissioners may have. This process ensures, of course, that the target will not be publicly disclosed until after the FCC has voted to take action. We are following that precedent here, so we will now proceed directly to a vote. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted, as I have a feeling may be requested in short order. Ms. Harold, please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Thank you for your consideration and for your votes on today's item, a notice of apparent liability for forfeiture, addressing apparent violations by an eligible telecommunications carrier, or ETC, of the Commission rules governing the Lifeline program. With me at the table are Keith Morgan, Deputy Chief, Rakesh Patel, Director of the Bureau's USF Anti-Fraud Team, Investigative Counsel Ramonda Williams, and Investigator Michael Zaire. Their extensive investigation led to today's item. Ramonda will now present the information.
Thank you, Rosemary. In this notice of apparent liability, we propose a penalty in the amount of $63,463,500 against American Broadband and Telephone Company, an ETC that received millions of dollars in universal service support in apparent violation of the Commission's Lifeline program rules. We find that the company's CEO, Jeffrey Anstead, is apparently jointly and severally liable for this proposed penalty. In August and September of 2016, American Broadband reported to the Commission that during an internal compliance review, it had discovered problems which caused it to receive overpayments from the fund. The company claimed to have corrected these problems. The Enforcement Bureau initiated an investigation to verify the information reported by the company. In so doing, the Bureau discovered apparent noncompliance related to two broad issues: the improper enrollment of subscribers and failed de-enrollment of subscribers. With respect to the apparent improper enrollments, American Broadband employed master agents who in turn hired sub-agents to enroll subscribers into the Lifeline program. These agents apparently manipulated personal identifying information to create ineligible Lifeline accounts. Specifically, the agents apparently manipulated names, addresses, date of birth, and social security numbers to create these ineligible accounts. The agents also apparently improperly used program eligibility documentation to enroll multiple individuals. They also apparently enrolled thousands of deceased individuals into the program. Despite receiving notice from its own compliance staff, American Broadband apparently continued to file improper claims seeking and receiving Lifeline support for the improper Lifeline accounts. With respect to the failed de-enrollments, American Broadband apparently failed to de-enroll subscribers who had failed to use their Lifeline benefit for more than 60 days as required by Commission rules. The company apparently failed to de-enroll and stop seeking support for subscribers who had transferred their Lifeline benefit to another ETC. The company also apparently failed to immediately de-enroll customers that it believed should have been de-enrolled. Instead, it devised a scheme to gradually de-enroll ineligible subscribers over a period of several months. Additionally, American Broadband apparently sought Lifeline support for subscribers that were never enrolled in the National Lifeline Accountability Database, which allows service providers to check on a real-time, nationwide basis as to whether a consumer is already receiving a Lifeline service and therefore is ineligible for additional reimbursement. Based on its improper enrollments and failed de-enrollments, American Broadband received millions of dollars in UF support to which it was not entitled. The Enforcement Bureau supports the Commission adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Williams, for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate you and appreciate your leadership in bringing this item forward. I'm going to stick to my general practice of not making formal statements in advance of a defendant's opportunity to respond to an NAL, but I do want to make 3 points. One, this NAL raises the lack of any formal or specific contractual terms in the agreements between Advanced Broadband and its subcontractors or master agents referencing compliance with FCC Lifeline rules. But the exclusion of such terms isn't a violation of our rules, and my question is, why don't we make that happen? Number two, the NAL discusses at length how American Broadband transferred its Lifeline support to the shareholders' personal and trust accounts. It does so to justify piercing the corporate veil, but suffice it to say, such commingling is also not against our rules. To the extent that maintaining separate accounts is necessary to ensure oversight and enforcement of our Lifeline rules, shouldn't commingling be prohibited as well? Number three, the NAL includes some extraneous details and language to help paint a picture and tell a narrative about Mr. Anstead's apparently excessive personal spending, while excluding any discussion of whether his company derived revenue from sources other than Lifeline. But enforcement action should be a dispassionate effort to enforce our rules and protect consumers. These are just some areas to consider, as we no doubt will see more Lifeline enforcement actions. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Every time a company steals $1 from Lifeline, it undermines the goals of the program. So the FCC has a responsibility to ratepayers and beneficiaries alike to hold bad actors accountable. In this case, appears to be a particularly egregious example of fraud. American Broadband apparently defrauded the Lifeline program to the tune of millions of dollars. And here's what the facts indicate. It sought and received support for dead people more than 45,000 times over just one 5-month period. When it found live customers, it would sign them up multiple times. In one case, using the person's name more than 20 times. It would also manipulate data to generate fake or ghost customers, including by making up dates of birth, using vacant lots as addresses, and by inventing social security numbers. Not to miss out on the action, one agent for the company even signed himself up twice. But the apparent con didn't stop there. As alleged in the notice, the owner of American Broadband illegally authorized the transfer of over $10 million in Lifeline funds to personal accounts. And he apparently used those funds to purchase a $1.3 million condo in Florida, to buy a $250,000 Ferrari, to pay for a country club and yacht membership, and for an $8 million jet, which he used to fly to the Cayman Islands. It would be hard to describe a more brazen or textbook example of fraud, particularly when the entire purpose of the Lifeline program is to benefit low-income individuals. So I'm glad that this FCC is taking strong action to hold bad actors accountable. And I want to thank in particular the staff, the investigators in the Enforcement Bureau for your diligent work in preparing this document and throughout the investigation. Thanks for your work, and the notice has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
The allegations that we have before us are ugly. We have a company that knew its agents were signing up bogus accounts to bilk the Universal Service Fund and harm the Lifeline program. This company submitted ineligible claims. It slow-rolled the removal of ineligible subscribers once it became clear the jig is up. And its owner used Universal Service funds to purchase a Ferrari, a jet, country club memberships, and tens of thousands of dollars for landscaping. Cheating the government should have consequences, no matter who does it, because this behavior is not right. But we should recognize that there are some other things that are not right. Last year, this agency announced plans to gut Lifeline service in a manner that could cut 70% of its current subscribers. Let's review who they are. We can start with the roughly 20,000 women, men, and children across this country who call a domestic violence hotline every day. 77% of domestic violence prevention programs distribute phones to help those who truly need a lifeline for safety. We can add the more than 500,000 Americans who live in Puerto Rico who rely on the Lifeline program for basic communications to stay connected in the aftermath of an epic storm. We can add another 1.3 million veterans who have honored us with their service and now rely on Lifeline program to help them in civilian life. On top of that, we can count nearly 2.2 million senior citizens who rely on this program to stay connected and stay healthy. When companies cheat the Lifeline program, we need to make clear there are consequences. We need to block the door, deny them the ability to participate, and throw the book at them, as we do here. But let's lead with our humanity and not cruelty. Let's not cut off the millions of Americans who count on this program to stay connected every day.
Thank you, Commissioner. The FCC's Lifeline program is designed to address the digital divide, in part to help provide affordable broadband and bring the benefits of digital opportunity to those Americans who need it most. Funding for this program, which comes from American taxpayers, should be used to empower low-income consumers, not line the pocket of unscrupulous wireless resellers participating in the program. But that is apparently what happened in this case, which involves a company, ironically, doing business under the name American Assistance. Let me recap some of the facts, although they have been explained in part before. The company, American Broadband, appears to have requested and received funding for tens of thousands of ineligible Lifeline customer accounts. The company's sales agents apparently created fake or duplicated accounts by using the names of dead people, by modifying the names, dates of birth, and social security numbers of actual Lifeline subscribers, by reusing the same proof of eligibility documents for multiple accounts, by listing the same single-family home addresses for dozens of accounts, and by using addresses where nobody actually lived. American Broadband also appears to have claimed funding for thousands of customers who hadn't been using the service for months, and thousands of others still who had switched already to another Lifeline provider. Month after month, the company apparently sought funding for accounts that it knew were ineligible to receive Lifeline benefits. And in August of 2016, after American Broadband told the FCC that it had taken action to ensure compliance with our Lifeline rules, the company still appears to have claimed Lifeline funding for more than 42,000 ineligible accounts. And meanwhile, as has been discussed, the owner of American Broadband apparently used the company's ill-gotten gains for a whole range of luxury items, not one of which has anything to do with closing the digital divide. And so, in short, this is a case about apparent fraud. And in response, we propose a fine of more than $63 million against American Broadband, which would be the largest ever penalty for violation of our universal service support rules. But we don't stop there. We also make clear that this proposed penalty is separate from any refunds that the company might owe to the Universal Service Fund, essentially to all of you, American taxpayers. And we order American Broadband to explain why we shouldn't revoke its FCC authorizations to offer service. Our message here could not be clearer. We will take aggressive and swift enforcement action against unscrupulous companies that abuse the Lifeline program and, by extension, the consumers who depend on it. American taxpayers who contribute this funding and the low-income Americans who rely on it deserve nothing less. For their meticulous investigative work on this case for a long period of time, I would like to thank Mary Beth DeLuca, Rosemary Harold, Jason Mastrangelo, Keith Morgan, Danqua Nguyen, Rakesh Patel, Michael Scarrato, Raphael Snyder, Ramonda Williams, and Michael Zaire from the Enforcement Bureau, and thanks as well to the dedicated staff from the Commission's other offices and bureaus for the work on this case, from the Office of General Counsel, from the Office of Inspector General, and from the Wireline Competition Bureau. The items having already been adopted, your work here is done. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time? Anybody? I have a few. We have a few changes in our office. First, Dr. Jay Schwartz. Well, he's not a real doctor. He's an economist. Economist with a PhD. But Jay has been our wireline advisor for some time, has done terrific work on a whole range of wireline issues. His most notable feature, however, is on the road, when he can tell you in Wall, South Dakota, or a tiny town in New Hampshire, some random building that has historical significance that no one would appreciate. He's also a fan, as am I, of the Wendy's Frosty on the road. Jay has moved to the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis. We will miss his dry wit, but he's not that far away, so we thank him for his work. Moving into Jay's position as wireline advisor is Nurali Patel. Nurali has been serving as special counsel in our office for a while. She will take over a lot of the wireline portfolio, and she's done a fantastic job already on some of the most challenging wireline items to come across the agenda, which Jay very deftly deferred to her. And taking Nurali's place is Preston Wise. Preston joins us as acting special counsel from the Wireline Competition Bureau. We've thrown him into the fire immediately, and he's already discharged his responsibilities with aplomb. Preston, it is great to have you on the team. I'd also like to take a minute to introduce one of our office's two law clerks for the fall, Lauren Houston, pronounced Houston like the city, not Houston like the street. She is a second-year law student at Catholic, where she is pursuing a certificate in the Law and Technology Institute. She's a staff member of the Catholic University Law Review, the president of the Law and Technology Students Association, and the vice president of Alumni Relations for the Federal Society chapter at Catholic. Before law school, Lauren worked on Capitol Hill for Senator Thune, Chairman Thune of the Senate Commerce Committee, and for the House Judiciary Committee. She hails from Missouri and is a graduate of the University of Missouri. We overlooked that credential and hired her anyway. On the side, she's also a photographer, as I understand it, and has taken very well-composed pictures of a variety of politicos and celebrities. She's also a champion baker. While in middle school, she won a $10,000 grand prize in the Kids Pillsbury Bake Off with a recipe called Berry Chocolate Tartlets. Much to our chagrin, she has not displayed her culinary expertise in the office yet, but the semester is young. So, Lauren, thank you for your service in our office. With additions also come some unfortunate subtractions, and it is with that sentiment in mind that I announce the departure of Bruce Romano. Bruce, I'm afraid, after all these years, I have to ask you to stand and receive the glare of the spotlight, if you don't mind. Bruce is retiring after 40 years of service with the FCC. 40 years! Unbelievable. Amazing. I mean, when he started the FCC, Saturday Night Fever was still probably in the theaters, and he's still staying alive 20, 40 years later. Bruce spent the first half of his career with the Media Bureau. For the last 20 years or so, Bruce has worked as the Associate Chief for Legal in the Office of Engineering and Technology. Now, when you're an attorney working in an organization filled with engineers, you're going to have your work cut out for you. I mean, you quickly learn that your portfolio extends well beyond purely legal work, and that has certainly been the case with Bruce. Bruce, of course, did all the things you would expect a lawyer to do in OET, overseeing the legal aspects of technical rulemakings, coordinating OET items with the Office of General Counsel, and explaining things in plain English to those of us who don't have the fortune to be engineers. But Bruce was very much more than that, as I learned when I was in the Office of General Counsel and had a chance to work with them on some fundamental amendments to our procedures. Bruce is the point person on some of the agency's most difficult issues, from RF exposure to jammers and the like. And I think it is for that reason that, Bruce, we are quite pleased that you've left us with your contact information going forward. We hope to reach you often. But I think if you were to ask Bruce what he's most proud of, I'm guessing he would say that it is all the things that he did to help the FCC's processes and people's lives a lot better, whether it was his work to enable new medical devices or new technologies, or help streamline the equipment authorization program, or educate people about issues that came up about unlicensed wireless devices. Bruce, I would like to think that I speak for my colleagues when I say we are deeply grateful to your service to the Commission. We wish you all the very best in your future endeavors, and please do stay in touch. Also today, I am pleased to announce the winners of the FCC's Excellence in Economic Analysis and Engineering Analysis Awards. The Excellence in Economic Analysis Award recognizes Commission staff for outstanding economic analysis conducted in the course of their work at the FCC, while the Excellence in Engineering Analysis Award similarly recognizes Commission staff who have made outstanding engineering, scientific, or technical contributions. Now, the winner of the 2018 Excellence in Economic Analysis Award is Kim Mackey of the Media Bureau. I don't know if Kim is here. Is she here? Ah, all right. Kim is receiving this award for her analysis of the economics of retransmission consent payments. If you figure that one out, you just let us know. Congratulations on the well-deserved award. On the engineering side, the winners of the 2018 Excellence in Engineering Award are Chachi Fan and Alex McDonald of the Wireline Competition Bureau. Are they here? I'm trying to see. All right. They are receiving this award for their engineering and statistical work to create standards and requirements for evaluating the performance of broadband networks funded with Connect America Fund, or CAF, high-cost universal service support, a critical part of our Digital Divide initiative. Thanks to both of you for that work. I want to congratulate all of these outstanding individuals for bringing their expertise and their dedication to bear on these important and complex topics, and again, thank them for serving at the Commission. Last but not least, we have another award that I want to mention from our Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. Rochelle Cohen, Greg Cook, Lisa Folks, Nikki McGinnis, and Linda Pintro. I don't know if they happen to be here, any of them, but they have been selected to receive the Department of Justice's 66th Annual Attorney General's Award for Outstanding Contributions to Community Partnerships for Public Safety for their incredible work in support of the National Blue Alert Network. The event for extending this award will be held on Wednesday, October 24th at DAR Constitutional Hall. Those of you who remember our adoption of this back in December, almost 10 months ago or so, will remember what an emotional moment it was. And that moment was brought about in part by the tremendous staff in the Public Safety Bureau. So wherever they are, thanks you to the Public Safety team for the efforts. If my colleagues don't have any further announcements, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting?
Agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Thursday, November 15th, 2018.
And with that, the meeting is adjourned.
I appreciate that.
All right, we are about ready to begin the open meeting press conferences, beginning with the chairman's. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chairman Pai. He's going to make some opening remarks, and we're happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Pelkey, and good afternoon. Obviously, the FCC just took significant steps towards freeing up licensed and unlicensed spectrum that will benefit consumers and promote U.S. leadership in 5G. But I want to take this opportunity to talk briefly about my trip last week to the Florida Panhandle to survey the damage from Hurricane Michael. Now, the first thing I would say is that much of the trip reminded me of other post-hurricane trips that I have regrettably had to make over the past year. I came across some remarkable stories of courage and generosity, and not just from first responders, but also ordinary citizens who put the interests of others ahead of their own safety and security. I was grateful for the opportunity to visit with staff from FEMA, as well as staff at a state emergency operations center, and I had a chance to thank these dedicated professionals directly and personally. Another familiar aspect was that local radio and TV broadcasters were some of the unsung heroes of the storm in their first informer roles, and even in the aftermath of Hurricane Michael. Again, I was thankful for the chance to meet with them and personally show my appreciation. But in certain respects, the aftermath of Hurricane Michael was truly extraordinary. I had the chance to take a helicopter ride over Panama City and Mexico Beach and Lynn Haven and St. George's Island, among other smaller communities in the Panhandle. And I have to tell you, it was striking to see home after home and even some large businesses completely decimated. The destruction was so complete in some neighborhoods that it was shocking to see that a building was still intact. And all over the place, you could see those blue tarps that had become, unfortunately, familiar in the wake of hurricanes. Now, obviously, with winds this powerful, you're going to have service outages, and getting service restored is no easy task. In South Georgia and in parts of the Florida Panhandle, service was quickly restored, as we saw with Hurricane Florence earlier this year. But I've let it be known publicly that I was not satisfied with the pace of the initial efforts to restore wireless networks in the areas near where Michael made landfall. In times like this, when people's lives have been shattered, nothing less than our best efforts was acceptable. Now, while in Florida, I sat down separately with staff from all 4 major national wireless companies, along with Comcast and a local fiber provider. And I wanted to make sure that all of them understood the urgency that I felt the situation demands. And I also wanted to hear from them to figure out what lessons can be learned so that they're not repeated next time. 2 issues that I heard about time and time again were, number one, that there was poor communication between and among the carriers and the power companies, and number 2, that fiber lines were being accidentally cut by power crews and others removing debris. And of course, these are 2 sides of the same coin. Along with that, the extraordinary amount of debris that had to be cleared in areas like Panama City and Mexico Beach clearly made this problem much worse. Well, thankfully, I have some good news to report. Late last night, I spoke with Manny Miranda, a representative of Florida Power and Light, whom Governor Scott has designated as the state coordinator of recovery efforts on behalf of the power companies. And Mr. Miranda told me that despite a lack of early coordination, power companies have now briefed their crews on the problem of fiber cuts, and that the number of new fiber cuts has dropped precipitously over the past 2 days. That is real progress, and that I hope is a trend that will continue as these networks need to get up and running still. I think there are lessons that we could all learn from our experience with Hurricane Michael. And in particular, I believe that it is time for a comprehensive reevaluation of the last administration's wireless resiliency framework. Are wireless carriers fully using that framework? Should backhaul providers be incorporated into it? Are power companies and carriers communicating effectively? And does the FCC have sufficient authority to ensure speedy restoration? Or should Congress step in to give us the tools we need to help restore service for Americans who are trying to recover from a disaster? These are just a few of the questions that I think need to be asked. But in the meantime, I would again like to express my thanks to all those people who have worked so hard and who are continuing to do everything they can to help the victims get back on their feet and help these communities bounce back. They are an inspiration to me, and I intend to honor their sacrifices by focusing on this issue until necessary improvements to emergency response have been made. And with that, I would open the floor to any questions.
Monty?
Monty Taylor, Com Daily. But anyway,
I was wondering if you could tell us if the FCC will tackle the national cap in 2018. Are there any plans to do so? Do you think it's likely to happen?
We're still studying the issue. I don't have anything to report today
But that's
on
not
either timing or substance.
So you can't say no, they won't?
I'm not. Good try, but I'm just simply saying there's no news to report on that front today.
John Handel, Politico. On Hurricane Michael, is there any plan to distill any of that in a report about what's happened there? Because I know obviously you mentioned some of the public safety staff have been asked to investigate and look at that, but is that going to result in a specific report or other things? And obviously you mentioned now the wireless resiliency framework is a big outcome potentially.
So we're taking a look at all of the options in terms of the formal work product that will be issued. You can't say specifically at this time, but I think it's important for us, especially in the wake of some of the things that we are learning in Hurricane Michael, to think broadly about emergency response. And based on my conversations with FEMA and state emergency staff and providers and power companies and the like, I think it's important for us to at least conceptually tackle the important issue here, which is how do we think about wireless resiliency in the context of an emergency? And as to the particular work product that emanates as a result of that, we'll have to see how things go.
Thank you.
Hi, Chairman Pai, Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I was wondering if on the 6 gigahertz item there was any discussion about how consumer need for Wi-Fi is possibly driven by unlimited mobile plans that will be slowed or throttled at a certain point in the month. It seems like, I think someone said that there was a lot of traffic from mobile consumers, even with unlimited plans, still relying on Wi-Fi.
Oh, so I myself in my statement mentioned the fact that offload of wireless traffic onto Wi-Fi networks is increasingly a feature of the wireless marketplace, and that's part of the reason why we think our 6 gigahertz proceeding offers particular value for consumers, for everybody in this space. And certainly I think as time goes on, I think you might see Wi-Fi using innovative spectrum like the 6 gigahertz band being more of the use case for many, many consumers going forward.
And Stan Giardelli. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to clarify your statements in the Lifeline enforcement item where you referred to it as being supported by taxpayers and by taxpayer contributions, when in fact it's not tax money, which I think that leaves the false impression that it comes out of the tax fund. So I just wanted to clarify that.
No, it is a tax. I mean, from a consumer perspective, when you get your bill every single month, there's a line item that says universal service fee. Whether you call it a fee or a tax, from a consumer perspective, it is money out of their pocket that is allocated for distribution by the federal government. And again, from the consumer perspective, I think it is a tax. And it's important, I think, for the FCC to be a responsible fiscal steward of those scarce funds, which are, after all, coming from taxpayers.
Hey, Margaret McGill with Politico. We've got the midterms coming up, so I'm wondering if you...
I'm not a candidate. Again, I just don't... It's
okay,
too late.
Well, I'll scratch that question.
Don't write me on any ballots. So,
do you intend to serve out your term as chairman if House Democrats take the majority?
We just got done with a very exciting October agenda meeting. We're focused on the work here at the FCC, and I can't speculate about hypothetical future election results that haven't even come in yet. So we're staying the course.
Hi, Alex Wiltz with Reorg M&A. I was wondering if there's anything upcoming regarding the team telecom review process, possibly and related to the existing NPRM that's out there?
So we're still studying the record on that and waiting for input from other interested stakeholders. So we don't have a particular time frame to report on that at this time.
Hi, Chairman. Casey Egan, S&P Global. So looking ahead to the rest of the year, besides the issues on today's agenda, what other issues do you believe are a priority for the FCC to tackle before the end of the year?
Well, the one thing I have said publicly, or two things actually I've said publicly that we are committed to doing by the end of the year is, number one, a item on rate of return telecom carriers to try to stabilize, to make sure that the funding is sufficient and predictable pursuant to the statutory requirements. And the other thing we are required to do under law is the media ownership quadrennial. And so I would expect at some point before the end of the year, we will tee that up.
Two of the commissioners today called for an NPRM on the 5.9 gig. I'm Howard Busker, Communications Daily, sorry.
I've heard of you, yes.
I need to get that out there. But it called for NPRM and the 5.9 gigahertz band. You had cable and others last week. It seems like there's a lot of stuff coalescing around that. Do you have anything for us on that? Like, what are your thoughts right now on 5.9?
So as to the merits, I mean, we're still studying the issue, but what I can say in terms of process is that phase 1 of the testing is complete, and I can announce today that we will be releasing the results of that testing and soliciting public comment on it at some point in the near future.
Matt Danneman, Communications Daily. When you're looking at opening the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band to terrestrial use, this is sort of a two-part question. On one hand, how does it affect agency thinking on doing that when you have 16,000 plus Earth stations that have now been registered in the C-band, so demonstrating a lot of activity? On the other hand, you have Intelsat et al. Now saying they can free up 180 megahertz for terrestrial use as opposed to 100 megahertz. How do these two factors, I guess, play into what the agency thinks about the possibility of opening this to terrestrial?
Right. So, I mean, look, we obviously have a pending NPRM on these issues, and what did Emperor Palpatine say? Everything is proceeding as we have foreseen. We teed up all of these possibilities in the NPRM, the market-based solution and the necessity of registering these Earth stations, et cetera. And so we're hopeful that we have a fruitful discussion based on the facts that are in the record, and we'll be able to move in the public interest based on those facts.
David Kaut, Communications Daily. A recent study said when you filter out all the duplicative comments in the net neutrality internet freedom proceeding, there were still 600,000 unique comments tied to specific U.S. addresses. Now, I know you all didn't make your policy based on polls, and you gave your best read of the law and took in the substantive comments, but can you give us any sense what you all did to ascertain the views of those at least 600,000 apparent unique comments and how you meaningfully address them in your order?
Again, this goes back to the order which was released almost a year ago. You can look through the several hundred pages of analysis where we discuss comments on this issue, and we synthesize those comments that meaningfully grappled with the proposals we outlined in the May 2017 NPRM. And at the end of the day, we believe that our conclusions have substantial evidence in the record behind them.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. A two-part question on China. Number one, about a week ago, 2 senators called on Canada not to include Huawei and ZTE in their next generation 5G networks. Do you agree with that? Can you say whether you think similar prohibition should be in U.S. 5G networks? And secondly, there was a report from Bloomberg recently that suggested that Apple, Amazon, and other telecommunications-related services may have been compromised by chips used by a company called Supermicro. A lot of U.S. intelligence officials have said there's no evidence of that, DHS. Have you seen any evidence that would validate that story, or have you been briefed about that issue?
On the first, I obviously can't comment on the particular views of those senators, other than to say that we obviously have an ongoing supply chain NPRM proceeding in which we are taking in the views of a whole variety of stakeholders, including some elected officials and others in the administration. As to the second question, I don't have any firsthand knowledge as to the accuracy of that report, but I have asked for a briefing on those issues in order to understand as best we can discern what the facts are.
John, Todd, anyone else? All right.
Happy Halloween.
Thanks, everyone. And at this point, I'll invite my colleague Mark Wigfield for the Bureau Press Conference.
Okay, for the Bureau portion, any questions on the OET item 6 gigahertz? Howard, so OET, are you here? There he is, okay.
Hi, yeah.
Hi. Yeah, my question, I just wanted to ask about, well, first of all, do you have any color on the changes that were made between when the item was circulated? It looked like there was some. I just wanted just anything you could, any little thing on that would be helpful.
Any little thing. It's fundamentally the same. There are some other questions that we ask about in it, and we hope to have the item out shortly.
Okay.
I think you heard a little bit in the presentation asking about, for example, whether we need to use the automatic frequency
Right.
coordination system for indoor use in a couple of those bands.
Right, yeah, the AFC issue. And then I also wanted to, there's been a lot of commentary about how there's a lot of users in that band, and that's going to be. Do you view this as a pretty complicated proceeding? I mean, just given the number of incumbents.
I think as we try to pack more and more things into Spectrum, it is more challenging, but we think what we've proposed is going to protect those services, and we're looking forward to the comments and development of a robust record to make sure that happens.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
Anything else? All right, thanks. Good. So the next item would be the wireless 3.5 gigahertz. Any questions on that? Howard also, so Wireless Bureau, come on up. Welcome back, Julie. Go ahead, Howard.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to ask, it's sort of a version of the last question on the 6 gigahertz, but were there any changes that were of note between what was circulated and what was approved?
There were no significant substantive changes, mainly clarifications and cleanup.
Okay. That's my main question. I'm sorry to get you all up there for just that. Anybody else?
Any others? All right, thank you very much. Media modernization, 2 items. Monty? Media modernization, Monty, Michelle. Good.
Hi, Monty.
Full iteration.
Hello. I have a couple quick questions about the broadcast one. If a station goes with the inventory of items instead of putting the actual filings online, I know there's like a 7-day deadline for them to produce it. Is that just to an FCC request or a request from the public?
It's any request.
Any
request from
request.
the public or the commission.
And is there any kind of mechanism for enforcing that? Like, what would I do if I make that request and I don't get all the documents I want, or I don't get it in 7 days? What do I do?
I'm not aware that we're, aware of any problems regarding that, but I assume if there were, then we would call the entity at issue and encourage them to file as soon as possible. But right now, I think it's been a hypothetical. I don't think we've encountered that situation.
Okay, that's all I have.
On Matt Daneman, Com Daily. On the LFA item, Commissioner O'Reilly had mentioned that there was a clarification to the draft. I guess a 2-part question: how did the draft change from what was circulated to what was voted on today, and specifically what was clarified, what was changed that he was
I think
referring to?
Commissioner O'Reilly spelled it out. He wanted to clarify that this item in no way changed the presumption that exists for effective competition that the commission adopted several years ago.
So
No
just
other-
language making that clear.
Yeah, no other significant changes.
Thank you very much.
Anything further? Okay, thank you. Next is, I believe, BDS. Any questions on, Lynn has a question on BDS. Wireline Bureau, please. Chris, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Hey, Lynn, go ahead.
I'm Stan Tiardelli. I just was wondering if you could shed a little bit of light on why the remanded issue from the Eighth Circuit has to go back out to seek more comment. I mean, if you put it in the previous order, didn't you think at the time that there was stuff in the record that supported it? But now you don't? So.
No, I mean, the court's remand indicated that it considered there to be a lack of notice on that issue.
Okay.
So therefore, the appropriate thing for the agency to do is to issue a further notice specifically seeking comment. It's a comment on the issue and gathering a record on which we can potentially go to R&L on that precise issue.
And to your point, the commission can consider the information that's already in the record in addition to any information that comes in.
Thank you.
Dave?
Yeah, Commissioner O'Reilly made reference to rate of return eligible rural carriers getting a second opportunity to elect in the incentive regulation. Can you give us any more detail on what that involves? Because that was new compared to the draft.
Right, that's a change that was made at the request of Commissioner O'Reilly in his office. And I think it's simply doing the same thing a second time. Other than that, a year later, offering another opportunity to elect into incentive regulation.
Okay. Were there any other significant changes to the draft?
We did make some changes in response to ex partes that we received in the record in the intervening 3 weeks or so since we issued the draft. Do you guys want to?
Yeah, I mean, there were some ex partes really in the 2 weeks before Sunshine, right? So you'll see a little
They were
bit.
almost all on that having more than one opportunity.
There were some others. NECA filed some suggestions
Okay.
about what we would sort of call implementation issues. You won't see significant changes, but some of those are reflected in what we expect will be released.
Okay.
And we do expect to release the item shortly.
Okay.
Anything further? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
And then the last item on the agenda is the Lifeline enforcement item. Any questions on that one? Apparently not. All right, thank you, everybody. And the commissioners are here for their press conference.
Everyone staying warm today? It's a little cold in here.
In here.
How can we be of assistance? Yes, sir.
Monty Taylor, Com Daily. Should the FCC act on the national cap this year?
That's something for the chairman to decide in terms of timing, I think. In terms of policy, I've already articulated multiple times, I think, to you and others, my viewpoints on the national cap.
Commissioner Carr, do you have a timing preference?
No, I leave it to the chairman to assess the state of the record, where he is in his decision, where staff is or is not on the item, and I'm happy to vote whenever an item comes up.
Thank you.
Commissioner O'Reilly, I wanted to ask if it would have technically been illegal to carve out a band that's catered to smaller providers. You know, I feel like there's a lot of discussion around trying to make this band accessible, even as some small providers say, well, the other licensing regimes aren't accessible for us. So what was that discussion around not only catering something to a subset of providers?
Well, we have obligations to have licenses widely distributed amongst a number of different entities under 309J, and so we do comply with those, and I think that while the last administration, the last commission may not have violated the statute, I think that the intent of how people viewed it and what the structure that they had set up effectively had limited the scope of who was going to be able to take advantage or was capable of. And I think what we've done today is remedy that problem and make it accessible to everybody on equal footing. We also addressed the concerns from small guys on multiple layers, including adding bidding credits that they had sought. So we did try to go the extra mile to address everyone's concerns. At the end of the day, we may not have gotten there. At least I didn't feel that we could get everybody on board, but we really did try, and spend an extra year on the issue. I think I said originally I had hoped that last Christmas we'd be done, and we're getting a lot closer to this Christmas. So we really did go the extra mile, I believe, really worked hard to try and get to an endpoint that everyone could support. It just didn't, it doesn't look like we have, but I think these are fully justified. I believe the decisions we made today, and I believe that the that the change in the marketplace, is one of the bigger reasons and why it's necessary to fix our rules.
Thank you. Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. I guess this is more for Commissioner Carr, but if you want to add to your statement yesterday, you're more than welcome to. Wanted to ask about the C-band alliance proposal regarding the freeing up 200 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band, and is that enough spectrum? Should more be made available?
I haven't studied that latest announcement, obviously getting ready for this proceeding. But when we did vote to move forward with that rulemaking, that is one of the things that I talked about in my statement, is potentially the fastest way to get this spectrum to market is to enable some secondary market transaction. So right now I don't have a specific spectrum goal in mind, and I haven't even drilled down to see what the latest proposal is.
Yeah, I'll ask a question.
Okay.
I know you guys defer to the chairman on the timing and the substance of, the proposals put before the commission, but do you want to say anything, or could you say anything about Commissioner Rosenworcel's comment during the Lifeline enforcement discussion that, your plans to on Lifeline service would gut it in a manner that would cut off 70% of its current subscribers? Are you concerned about that?
Look, we have an open proceeding. I do defer to the chairman in terms of the timing and what actions we get to that point. But we have an open proceeding. We're taking comments on it, and we're reading that record, and we'll digest it at the appropriate time.
Have you found any support for it?
Well, I think that
the reseller, banning resellers?
I must admit, I've been slightly preoccupied with another topic that we considered today, so I haven't gone through the record myself. But I think that there are varying views on what the proposal, and we'll just see where it goes when the chairman makes a decision.
Well, the item that we voted on today, I think as at least alleged in the facts, we're going to let the proceeding play out, was a pretty egregious example of fraud in the program. And I'm someone that is perfectly comfortable saying, on the one hand, there's plainly, if this case plays out, or if you look at past cases, unacceptable fraud in the Lifeline program. And why is it unacceptable? One, because it steals from those that are intended to benefit. So it's not being put to right use. So I'm perfectly comfortable saying that and addressing those issues. And there's a separate set of issues that says, are there reforms that we need to do through this rulemaking or otherwise to make sure that the program is carrying out its intended purposes? And I think those are two discussions that don't necessarily need to bleed one into the other. You can think that there's a tremendous amount of fraud, and that doesn't necessarily mean an outcome per se with the broader discussion of the rulemaking. And I think vice versa, and it's an open rulemaking, and people are filing comments, and it's important. And at the right time, we'll take a look at what's in the docket and reach final decisions. It's not something that I've needed to do or done at this point in terms of reaching a final decision.
No, Howard?
Yeah, I had a couple questions. First of all, on 6 gigahertz, I've heard a lot of commentary that we asked the Bureau this earlier, but that's kind of, there's a lot of incumbents in there, and is that how difficult is it going to be to, and just what's your sense? I was wondering what both of your senses are after having looked at this band now over the last month.
Well, it's not just last month. I've been talking about this ban for quite a while.
I know. But
so I've been working with multiple parties in terms of is there going to be harmful interference that could be potentially caused, and then potential mitigation remedies. And you've seen a ton of stuff already submitted to the record, and that's what the NPRM will do. It explores those issues. I believe we can come to a place that allows unlicensed service without causing harmful interference to the incumbents. We obviously will have some incumbents that will probably not be there if we move forward on the C-band reallocation type of thing, that there won't be the uplink necessary. So that is at least one incumbent that may not necessarily be needed. But there's definitely there are definitely providers in that space, and we're going to have to take care of them and make sure that any technology, especially unlicensed, goes forward in the space doesn't cause that harmful interference.
Okay, and then I also wanted to ask, what kind of unlicensed uses are you guys hoping to see? I mean, one of the things I think, one of the complaints has been that there's not big enough channels, and then if you get bigger unlicensed channels, that's going to open up a lot of. What are we looking at? Do
Well,
you
I think
in the
you see
future?
that the item digests the different proposals for the different portions, Uni 5 and Uni 7 being different than Uni 6 and Uni 8 that we're proposing. But I think if you complement that with the other parts that I've raised, other people have commented upon, 5.9 being right next door provides an opportunity to have really wide swaths of unlicensed spectrum. And so I think that's a complement, something that could be really revolutionary in terms of services. Why I've pushed for it for a long while. Why I think it's the band that we should definitely move forward on unlicensed. I think the 6 gigahertz is something I've been championing, and so I think the two together is a great picture. And what you add to that is right next door to what's already offered in 5 gigahertz. That's a great opportunity, having the wide channels that you spoke of. And I'm excited what can be done if we allow that to happen.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about the band. I mean, you asked about incumbents and interference, and there was a statement in my meeting statement today about that issue. And I'm open-minded at this point as to how we resolve those. I think there's still work that has to be done. I'm most excited about the idea that we're taking essentially 5 times the amount of spectrum that we've had so far. We see all this innovation in the existing bands, and so I'm confident that we'll find a path forward, and it'll unleash even more innovation to come.
Yeah, and just to clarify what I was asking, because what I've heard is that since it's so much spectrum and there's so many different kinds of incumbents, it's just more complicated than some of the other bands that the FCC has looked at in the past, like 3.5, where it's primarily the naval radars, for example. That was my question.
Yeah, I get the point you make, and I recognize that. I think everything's more complicated these days. Spectrum policy is becoming more complicated. As someone else highlighted, the easy work, the easy lifting's already been done. We're into the medium and the hard lifting. But this is a band that can be very valuable for unlicensed services. I think I agree with Commissioner Carr's point. I'm very confident that we can address any concerns on harmful interference and we can move forward. I think you complement that with what's next door on 5 gigahertz and then addressing the 5.9, finality. There's a situation where we may have an opportunity to reallocate. I've called for reallocating a portion of that, and that'd be very clean spectrum. If we can address the 75 megahertz that's at 5.9, if we can shrink that to a more reasonable swath, we're able to free up. I think you can at least free up 45 megahertz of very clean spectrum for unlicensed services.
Circling back to 3.7, 4.2 gigahertz band.
Sure.
With the 16,000 plus Earth stations that have been registered thus far and still several days to go, what's that say about, particularly you, Commissioner O'Reilly, you've been very vocal about opening this up. What's that say about the difficulty that's going to be potentially in opening this up to terrestrial use, given that kind of congestion?
Well, I've been very clear that the existing contractees are going to need to be taken care of and make sure that their services are still offered, whether it's in the C-band itself or through another technology or another satellite service. So we're going to have to address and we indirectly through the alliance is going to have to address the existing contractee issue. I believe that can be done. I don't think the 60,000 number that you cite. We're working through some of those numbers ourselves, and we have a couple more weeks left on terms of registration process for the Earth stations. But I know that the coalition or the alliance believes that they can reconfigure the band to take care of those issues within the existing technology, and may require some new satellites. We'll just have to see. But we're in the early part of that stage. I think the ground is yet to be finalized, but it's in a very good place, and I don't see the number of Earth stations registration being a problem at all.
Commissioner Carr, nothing to add to that? Or?
No, nothing to add. I think I'm glad that we're getting this information in the record. I personally haven't reviewed it yet and looked at where they are, what frequencies
But
they
that's
are.
what your Saturday mornings are for.
Those are media reform Saturdays. Saturdays is for media
Satellite
reform.
registrations. See, now you got a new. Since the chairman's taking away all your other fun things.
Yeah, no, I'll introduce it. We'll see how it plays. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, please.
Any other questions? Anything else we can answer before we head to lunch?
I do have one quick one for Commissioner Carr. Did you actually climb that whole broadcast tower, or was there an elevator? How did you actually get up that tower?
So it's an interesting question. So there is what the crew calls a sardine box. It's essentially a little elevator inside the structure that takes you part of the way up, and then you climb. There's pieces of it. We can show more footage. But actually, the elevator piece was, in some ways, the scariest part of it, because you're in a very confined spot, you're outdoors essentially in a cage with two other people right there. So you go part of the way up in the elevator, and then you climb up to the top from there. And the work that those crews do is amazing. It really gives you an appreciation for what they do. When you turn your phone on, and I think most of us just assume it's pixie dust that gets the data to the phone. And I gotta tell you, it's a tremendous amount of work, and there's some real professionals that get this job done.
The term sardine box does make it sound like it'd be a pretty comfortable ride up on the way up.
Yeah, it's cozy.
Well, anything else we can answer? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Anything?
Do you expect the FCC to alter the national cap in 2018?
I love your tenacity and persistence. I know for my part, I agree with the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, which suggests that this should be done by Congress.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, Casey Egan, S&P Global Market Intelligence. In the upcoming election, in the case that the House flips, how would you like to see the Congress's oversight role of the SEC change?
I can't really comment on the upcoming election. I do think, no matter who's in charge, oversight of this agency and other agencies like it is vitally important. It's a good thing for the American public when Congress engages in oversight.
I'll follow up on Monty's tactic. Do you expect the FCC to act on its Lifeline rulemaking by the end of the year? I know
Well,
you don't set the agenda, but are you getting any sense
I know, I
of
keep
that?
on hearing that from my colleagues. That might be even more true for me. I have made clear that I have concerns with the chairman's Lifeline proposal. He has proposed cutting as much as 70% of the Lifeline program. And it's important to remember who those people are. Those are phones that are used in domestic violence shelters. They're used by veterans. They're used by senior citizens. They're used by individuals in Puerto Rico and elsewhere recovering from hurricanes and storm damage. They're used by 650,000 LGBT youth who are on our streets and vulnerable. I think we have to keep them front of mind when we think about Lifeline and make sure we lead with our humanity and not cruelty.
Can I follow up on that? Lynn Stanton, TR Daily. When you say cutting 70%, does that mean that those subscribers have no other option, or just that they are currently subscribed to the wireless resellers who would be removed from the program?
70% figure reflects the reseller figure that was in the rulemaking.
But you don't know, do you have any figures on, because I know in some areas those are the only options, but I
You're
don't
right.
have a good
Yeah.
grasp
No,
of
that's a really good
widespread.
question. It's something that we should certainly be researching a little more.
Thank you.
Commissioner Rosenworth, Matt Daneman,
Yeah.
Communications Daily. You supported the flexible use for 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz band.
I supported the rulemaking.
Yeah, right.
Right.
I guess I'm wondering with hypothetically, if you have incumbent satellite operators who are talking about maybe they can make more spectrum available than had previously been thought, how does that affect your thinking on that particular proposal, hypothetically?
You know, we're going to see. We still have, as you know, Earth stations being registered. We extended the deadline. So we're going to take a look at what we have on our record and the stations that have been registered and think a little bit about the precedent that's being set here. And we'll take a look at it and give some hard thought to what they proposed.
Howard Busker, Communications Daily. Are you disappointed that, the chairman had an opportunity to commit to doing an NPRM on 5.9. I don't know if you heard that, but there was no commitment on that at this point.
What this agency committed to, in coordination with the Department of Commerce and the Department of Transportation, was completing in-lab testing by January of 2017. It's almost 2 years later. No results have been released, no information has been offered, no rulemaking has been started. And in the meantime, technology has moved on, and that test plan is dated. This is a shame, because we've lost time when it comes to getting unlicensed airwaves out to the public. And we have a huge opportunity in the 5.9 gigahertz band to look and see if we can have unlicensed use safely. Our inability to release that material, the amount of time it's taken us to do so, is unacceptable, and it's slowed down the rate at which wireless reaches the marketplace.
Is the idea that the FCC would have to finish the work that it's already started on, from a couple years ago, but then start concurrently in NPRM that would raise some bigger issues?
Well, the original idea was that they would do testing in the laboratory and then on the road, and start a proceeding here, assuming that testing went well, to identify how to modernize the 5.9 gigahertz band. But we've just been sitting for 2 years without any information to the public, and that's a shame. This is a band that is prime for growing our Wi-Fi footprint, and we're not doing anything about it.
But to be clear, though, the NPRM that people are talking about would probably happen concurrently with them hopefully finishing. That's the idea, right?
Well, the last commitment this agency made was to complete testing in January of 2017. That's 2 years ago. We are behind.
Okay. And then I also wanted to ask you, what do you see as being, as we move into more spectrum for unlicensed, and you go to CES, and I know you're interested in the technology. What is it going to open up to have these wider channels in unlicensed?
We certainly ask questions in the 6 gigahertz band rulemaking about that, and that's good. That's a start. Looking at the 5.9 gigahertz band would also help. But the bottom line is we need more unlicensed spectrum, and we need wider channels, especially if we want unlicensed to take advantage of the new standard, which is 802.11ax, or rebranded as Wi-Fi 6, which has extraordinary opportunities to have more permissionless innovation without having a contract. There's so much we can do with wireless if we make more unlicensed available to more innovators. And I'm excited about the possibility of wider channels. I think that our questions about them in this rulemaking are important.
Thank you.
Hi, Commissioner Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. Former Commissioner Clyburn recently said that it's a worthless exercise to pursue being first to 5G if that's not applied in a way that's good for underserved communities. Do you have thoughts, in that vein?
Well, I know that our leadership in 4G was dramatic. We have 5% of the world's population, and at one point we had about 50% of its 4G deployment. And as a result, we had incredible innovation happen here. The applications economy, smartphone operating systems, they all came from the United States. And we exported that economy worldwide. So there's a lot of energy and effort to make sure that our 5G leadership, we don't cede all that opportunity to some other country. And I think it's important for us to be mindful that other countries are interested in being at the head of the curve on 5G, and we've got to do more to make sure that we're at least near the front of the pack.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dave Shermanson from Reuters. Can I ask you, do you think that SEC and DOT should continue with phases 2 and 3, or do you think there'll be enough information from phase 1 to proceed with the rulemaking?
I think we have to make our phase 1 material public. It should have been public 2 years ago. I think it's appropriate 2 years in, however, to update our test plan to reflect more modern technologies and more modern services.
Do you simply believe that either the spectrum can be shared, or do you think that the auto industry essentially ceded that space as they've largely unused?
Well, the earlier test plan was premised on the idea that dedicated short-range communication systems could share the band with unlicensed services. And it acknowledged that only a portion of the 75 megahertz that was set aside was specifically set aside for safety purposes. So we were trying to make sure that those safety purposes could remain intact while simultaneously accommodate more Wi-Fi. I think that that approach has a lot of merit to it, but we could certainly build on it with more modern ideas about unlicensed if necessary. All good?
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
We've been here for a long time. You know what I mean?
So you hanging here, or you going back out?
I